My name is Jace Mercer, and I want to tell you something about the moment a room empties. It happens fast, faster than you would think. One alarm, one calculation, one door, and the people who were there a moment ago are simply not there anymore. Not because they are cowards, because they are rational, because the math said go and they listened to the math. I have always had a complicated relationship with math. Not because I am bad at it, I am reasonably good at it. I am reasonably good at it. I can run the numbers and read the result and understand what the result is telling me to do. The complication is that I have never quite been able to make myself believe that the result is the whole answer. That the numbers contain everything that matters. That when the math says, go, going is the only thing a person with any sense would do. Every human I have ever known has had some version of this complication. We run the numbers, and we look at the result, and then we look around to see if there is something the numbers did not count. On the station concourse of Kara 3 on a Wednesday afternoon, when the containment alarm went off in the research section, and every person within range ran the numbers and moved for the door, I looked around. There was something the numbers had not counted. Her name was Orvan Sale, and she was a Tifian research scientist who had been working in the inner research section when the alarm triggered, and she was on the wrong side of the emergency containment barrier that had sealed automatically when the alarm hit, and she was visible through the transparent barrier panel with the particular expression of someone who understood exactly what was on the other side of the barrier with her and was being very controlled about it. Everyone else had seen her too. The math had counted her and come to a result that everyone except me had accepted. The containment barrier was sealed. The intersection was compromised. The breach was a biological containment event involving an experimental compound from the xenobiology lab that the research team had been working with under strict protocols for 6 months. The compound was not immediately lethal to most species, but its interaction effects with Tethian biology specifically were in a category the research documentation described as severe and requiring immediate medical intervention. Describe inside, exquesting with the severe. And requiring immediate medical intervention. Immediate medical intervention was on the other side of a sealed containment barrier. I was also on the other side of a sealed containment barrier. On the outside of it, I had been in the outer research corridor when the alarm hit, running a routine maintenance check on the ventilation relay, which put me outside the sealed section and inside the containment zone perimeter, which was a more useful position than it might sound. I knew this station. 7 months of maintenance work had given me the station the way 7 months always gave me. A ship or a station, completely and from the inside out, including the containment system architecture which I had worked on directly 4 months ago when the inner research section had been upgraded. The containment barrier had 2 override points. One was in the station security office 3 corridors away, which required command authorization and the 2-person verification, and was the correct and proper way to open a sealed containment barrier. The other was in the maintenance access panel in the outer research corridor wall, 4 meters from where I was standing, which was the emergency manual override that maintenance crews needed, in case the automated system sealed with a crew member inside who needed immediate extraction. That override required 1 person with the right access code. I had the right access code because I had installed that panel 4 months ago, and the access code was in my maintenance documentation because I had filed complete documentation on every job I had ever done. I was 4 meters from the panel. Orvan Sale was on the wrong side of the barrier with a biological compound that her biology could not safely process and a clock that was running. I ran the numbers. Then I looked at what the numbers had not counted. I went to the panel. The access code took 8 seconds to enter because I was doing it carefully and not rushing because rushing with access codes caused errors, and errors were not something I had time for. The panel opened. The override was a physical switch, 3 positions, sealed, standard, and emergency extraction. I moved it to emergency extraction, and the containment barrier in the intersection retracted to a 1-meter opening, enough for a person to come through. Orvan Sale came through in 4 seconds, which told me she had been watching the panel from the moment she saw me move toward it and had been ready. I moved the switch back to sealed before I turned around because the breach was still active and the barrier needed to be closed, and in the 15 seconds it had been open, the outer research corridor had received some level of atmospheric exposure from the intersection. I did not think about that yet because there were more immediate things to think about. Orvan Sale was standing in the outer research corridor with her hands at her sides and her breathing controlled and her eyes on me with an expression that I was going to understand better in a few minutes once the adrenaline had settled. I said, "Are you hurt?" She said no. I said the compound exposure. She said minimal. The breach had been in the far section. She had been near the barrier when the alarm hit and had not been in the primary exposure zone. I said we needed to get to the medical section. She said yes. We went. The medical section was 4 corridors from the research wing, and we covered it in 3 minutes, and the medical officer, a Kathiran named Tail, who was already briefed on the containment event, took over the moment we came through the door, and I stepped back and let her work. I sat down on a bench outside the treatment room and thought about the outer research corridor and the 15 seconds the barrier had been open and the atmospheric exposure question that I had not thought about yet and was thinking about now. Station security found me 12 minutes later. The officer in charge was a Valdorian named Voss, senior and thorough, and he sat down beside me on the bench with a data tablet and the expression of someone who was going to conduct a very complete interview. He said the containment barrier manual override had been activated. I said yes. He said by a maintenance crew member with panel access. I said yes. He said during an active biological containment event. I said yes. He said during an active biological containment event. I said yes. He said the override protocol required command authorization and 2-person verification. I said the command authorization protocol applied to the security office override. The maintenance manual override is a separate system with a separate protocol designed for emergency crew extraction. He looked at his tablet. He said, "You are correct." He said he had not known there were 2 override systems. I said, "It is in the upgrade documentation from 4 months ago." Section 7. He said he would read Section 7. He looked at me. He said the outer research corridor received atmospheric exposure during the 15-second window. I said yes. He said you were in that corridor. I said yes. He said you have been assessed for compound exposure. I said the medical officer checked me when I brought Orvan Sale in. The exposure was below the threshold for treatment for my biology. Monit, Oring recommended for 48 hours. He said you knew there would be exposure when you opened the barrier. I said I knew it was possible. I did not know the level until after. He said you opened it anyway. I said yes. He looked at me for a long moment. He said every other person in the containment zone perimeter evacuated when the alarm hit. I said yes. He said you went toward the barrier. I said there was someone on the wrong side of it. He said the math suggested the barrier should stay sealed until command authorization was obtained. I said the math did not count how long command authorization would take versus how long Orvan Sale had before the compound exposure became a medical problem. He said, "How long was that window?" I said, based on the research documentation I had read during the upgrade 4 months ago, Tethian biology and that specific compound class, approximately 20 to 30 minutes from significant exposure before the interaction effects reached a level requiring immediate intervention. He said, "You read the research documentation 4 months ago." I said, "I read everything related to systems I work on." He said, "And you remembered it today." I said it was relevant today. He was quiet for a moment. The treatment room door opened and the medical officer came out and looked at both of us and said Orvan Sal was stable and the exposure had been below the threshold for serious interaction effects, and she would be monitored for 24 hours, but was expected to be completely fine. I let out a breath. Voss looked at me, let out that breath. He said that mattered to you. I said of course it mattered. He said you did not know her. I said I did not need to know her. He was quiet again. He said, "I have one more question." I said, "Yes." He said the 15 seconds the barrier was open, the atmospheric exposure, the 48-hour monitoring, you accepted all of that before you touched the panel. I said I accepted that it was possible. I did not know the level until after. He said, "But you knew there was a risk." I said, "Yes." He said, "Why?" I thought about it the way it deserved. I said, "Because the numbers told me to leave, and I looked at what the numbers had not counted. And what they had not counted was more important than what they had." He looked at me steadily. He said, "What had they not counted?" I said a person on the wrong side of a barrier who needed to be on the right side of it. And the fact that I was the one person in the right position, with the right access code at the right moment to do something about that. He said, "You think that obligated you?" I said, "I think it made the decision for me." Obligation is the wrong word. It was just the obvious next thing to do. He was quiet for a long time. Then he closed his data tablet and sat back. He said, "I have been doing station security for 18 years. I said, "Yes." He said, "I have filed a great many incident reports." I said, "Yes." He said I have never filed one where the finding was that a maintenance crew member read 6-month-old research documentation, remembered it under pressure, calculated a biological interaction timeline, used a manual override system that most of the station did not know existed, accepted personal exposure risk, and extracted a trapped researcher in 15 seconds. I said it was not that complicated once I knew the override was there. He said most people did not know the override was there. I said it was in Section 7. He said he was going to read Section 7. He stood up. He said, Jace Mercer. I said, yes. He said, the 48-hour monitoring. I said, yes. He said, rest. I said, I will. He walked back toward the security office, and I sat on the bench outside the treatment room and thought about Wednesday afternoons in empty rooms and the things that is. Numbers did not count, and the moment when a room empties and you look around and find the thing that is still there needs doing. The treatment room door opened again, and Orvon Sale stood in the doorway with the careful expression of someone who had been through something, and was on the other side of it, and was taking a moment to understand that. She looked at me. She said, the override panel. I said, yes. She said, you installed it 4 months ago. I said, yes. She said, you remembered it today. I said, I remember everything I install. She was quiet for a moment. She said, you accepted the exposure risk. I said, it turned out to be below treatment threshold. She said, but you did not know that when you opened the panel. I said, no. She looked at me with those large, dark Tathian eyes that were doing careful and genuine work. She said, why? I said the same thing I had said to Voss, about the numbers and what they had not counted, and she listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. She said, humans. I said, yes. She said, the assessments describe your species as emotionally driven and resistant to purely rational frameworks. I said, that is one way to say it. She said, what is another way? I thought about it. I said, we run the numbers and then we look for what the numbers missed. And we have a long practice of finding that what the numbers missed is usually the most important thing in the room. She held my gaze. She said, that saved my life today. I said, the override panel saved your life. I just knew it was there. She said, and remembered it and used it and accepted the risk and did not run when every other person in the corridor ran. I said, yes. She said, that is not nothing. I said, no. It is not nothing. She sat down on the bench beside me, and we sat together outside the treatment room on a Wednesday afternoon on Station Karath through. And the station ran its quiet systems around us, and outside the viewport the outer belt moved in its slow, indifferent way. After a while she said, thank you. I said, you are welcome. We sat there for a while longer, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.